Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Wildlife of the American Southwest, presented by wildlife biologist and NatHab expedition leader, Aaron Bott. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Really excited to be talking about today's subject. I think all of the presentations offered by Natural Habitat Adventures are really entertaining. They're very fun. It's a great way to learn more about the world around us. And I'm excited to specifically be talking about the American Southwest with you all today. This presentation that I'm about to give is pretty informal, and it's also hopefully going to be entertaining. I'm going to be specifically talking about the region in the Southwest where NatHab offers its canyons trip. So I'll talk about the Colorado Plateau and some of the wildlife that we find in this area. I'll also give you a little bit of a background regarding the human history and the natural history or the geology, the deep history of this area. So if you bear with me, it's going to be a fun ride. And again, hopefully you will all walk away from this with something new that you've learned. A little bit of a background about me. Again, my name is Aaron. I work as a wildlife biologist. I work with state and federal governments. I was just telling Kendall that I wasn't really sure if I was going to make the meeting today because just a few minutes ago I was out in Capitol Reef where we were doing mule deer captures. We were flying around and catching them with helicopters and putting on radio collars and sending them off, checking population and classifications. And then yesterday I was actually on Bears Ears National Monument and just outside of Arches National Park. So I'm constantly in the field here in the Southwest, as well as up in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where I work researching wolves. Wolves, predators, grizzly bears, cougars, those are my specialty. But today, here we are talking about everything else that we'll find here in the Southwest. I personally am very connected with the American West. I've done multiple presentations for Natural Habitat Adventures talking about the American West and the biodiversity that we have out here. My family has been out here for 7 generations. If you can't see the resemblance, I'll point out that these are some of my earliest family members that settled out here in the Utah Territory back in the 1850s, early 1850s. My dad's family settled up in the Yellowstone country, and my mom's family settled down here in the southwestern Colorado Plateau area. So I'm very connected to the Intermountain West. I'm very interested in its history, deep history, current history, natural history, and human history. So I'm excited to talk to you about this region that I love so much. Really quickly, I'd like to cover kind of the basis. If you've never been out here in the American Southwest, if you've never participated in the NatHab trip down through the canyons, let me give you a little bit of a background. Here in the center of this satellite map, you can kind of see a reddish hue, which is what's known as the Colorado Plateau. The Colorado Plateau is a high arid desert found in the heart of the North American continent. Geologically speaking, it's pretty bizarre. It's an interesting anomaly. Millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, when tectonic plates were moving around and the world looked different, more different than we would recognize today, North America was not recognizable, or you would not know it for what it is today. At one point in time, where we are here in the Southwest was under the ocean, and as converging tectonic plates and diverging tectonic plates moved about, eventually we had continental drift, and we actually, where we are today, was just in the trade winds belt, just above the equator in the northern hemisphere, similar in environment as to the Saharan desert today. We had what was known as an erg, or an ocean of sand, which swept across this region, and over tens of millions of years, these sand particles, they cemented with calcite, and more layers and more alluvial fans, more erosion took place over time, creating multiple layers of of sandstone and shell and different sedimentary layers, which eventually went from sea level to about 6,000 feet above sea level on average. In the last 10 to 60 million years, we had what was known as an orogeny, actually a series of orogenies, which is an oro, Greek for mountain, genesis, beginning, where the continental North American plate collided with the Florian Pacific plate, and eventually you had what is a bubble or a rising mountain, continental mountain, pop up in the middle of the Southwest. And so today we have this very arid climate, many different layers of sandstone and again shale and other sedimentary rocks that are high in elevation, extending from 4,000 feet above sea level to 12,000 feet above sea level, in what is kind of like a rocky tiramisu. My wife and I like to watch the Great British Baking Show, and when they, in one of those episodes, made a tiramisu with lots of different layers, I pointed out to my wife, I said, that's it. That's the Colorado Plateau. It's basically a bunch of different layers stacked up on top of one another. And there you have the Colorado Plateau. During the Pleistocene or the Ice Age, we had a lot of shields of ice, glaciation, that didn't quite make it down to the Colorado Plateau, but they did make it regionally in different islands throughout the Central Rockies and the Northern Rockies, which then, as those glaciers retreated, you had a lot of runoff, and over tens of thousands of years, you essentially had canyons, and you had deep canyons and incredible canyons that came to be thanks to erosion and the forces of water and the forces of gravity, and also the forces of freeze-thaw cycle. So you have cold winters, hot summers, and rocks that are relatively soft, breaking apart, creating a very dramatic landscape. This region has been recognized for its charismatic beauty for eons, since humanity has first come across them. But in this last 20th century, we had a recognition of these beautiful landscapes that were then protected as national parks. And the railroads came in, the peoples came, and they began to recognize this fantastic Grand Canyon, Zion, Bryce Canyon National Park loop, where people from all over the world could come and appreciate these natural wonders. So if you participate in the NatHab trip, you're essentially following the same route that was coined over 100 years ago by the Pacific Railroad and the National Park Service. These areas, these landscapes that we highlight on the trip are Grand Canyon National Park, which really doesn't need much of an introduction. It's this incredible canyon that's been carved over the last 5 to 6, perhaps 10 million years. The Colorado River just incising deeper and deeper and deeper through all these sedimentary layers until we have what is the largest canyon in the world. That is just south of the state of Utah in northern Arizona. We also have Bryce Canyon National Park, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually not a canyon, where you have all these sedimentary layers at a very high elevation, exposed to snows and freezing ice, which split the rock along fissures in the sedimentary rock and create these weird hoodoos, this very bizarre landscape. My grandparents are actually, they were from the community just beyond those hoodoos here that we see in the picture, in the community known as Tropic. And my mom was born about 20 miles to the west of there in a place known as Panguitch. So really cool landscape, really bizarre. And of course we have Zion National Park, which is another canyon, the Virgin River, again incising from the high mountains, cutting down through this impressive display of Navajo sandstone, creating this citadel of red rock. I'm a little bit biased because I appreciate Zion and Bryce so much, but I want to point out, in case you've never been to the Southwest, that a lot of people come to visit the Grand Canyon. It's a bucket list item to see, But from my experience working in these national parks, most people walk away being awed the most by either Bryce or Zion, just because they didn't have them on their radar. They weren't expecting them to be so magnificent. So if you do come out, I really am excited for you to appreciate Bryce and Zion National Park, as well as the Grand Canyon, which is, of course, fantastic and magnificent. Now, these national parks were homes to many peoples throughout history. Throughout this entire region, we have many remnants of the ancestral Puebloans and the Fremont cultures, different indigenous peoples who inhabited these areas, that created civilizations, and they left their marks here in the rock, carving petroglyphs, and in some cases pictographs upon the rocks. They're a little bit of a mystery. Some of these cultures and civilizations vanished without much of an explanation. And then contemporarily, we have other indigenous peoples living here today, still on the landscape. We have, specifically in this region of the Colorado Plateau, the Navajo, the Hopi, some bands of the Shoshone, as well as the Goshute and the Ute and the Paiute tribes. So all of these different Native American tribes still are around today. Obviously, they're vibrant people. They have rich cultures, rich communities, and this is still a place that they call home, and they have called it home for millennia. And it's a really incredible place to be, and you can see why peoples from all over history and all over the world have come to visit these dramatic landscapes. Now, of course, we also have Euro-American expansion, and in the 1840s, we had the Mormon exodus coming west. That's why my family moved out west. They came straight from Scandinavia. They joined the Mormon Church, or what's known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And at the time, the church was founded actually in upstate New York, but a lot of persecution and a lot of mistrust of a novel religion eventually forced the leader of the church, Brigham Young, who was the leader to follow the originator of the church, Joseph Smith. He eventually said, you know what, we can't handle the persecution. We're going to leave the United States. We're going to go west of the Mississippi River, and we're going to find a country that we can call our own, and we don't have to worry about the United States government. So ironically, the Mormons left west. They left the United States, and again came out here to what was then actually Mexico, and they began to settle what is today Utah, as well as Idaho, parts of Montana, Nevada, and Arizona, in these very independent colonies. And here's a picture, in case you don't recognize the great metropolitan area of Salt Lake City. I put the caption up there, but this is the humble beginnings of that city. It wasn't too long, actually, that after the Mexican War ended, the United States government did take over these territories, and these Mormon colonies were once again brought under the citizenship of the United States. Mormon peoples, as well as Native peoples, had mixed relations. They got along or they didn't. Sadly, it's pretty much the same across all over the history books. When we read about the expansion of of Euro-American peoples encroaching on indigenous lands, we see great and wonderful stories, heartwarming stories, where the peoples helped one another out. They were kind to one another, and they worked well. They intermarried. They became friends. And then, of course, we have the all too familiar atrocities and genocides that we all know about. The Mormons were just the first wave, though, that settled here in the Intermountain American West. What really was the driving spike that moved us into the future was the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869, just north of Ogden, Utah, which is north of Salt Lake City, Utah. Here we had finally the stitching together of two halves of the continent, two halves of the United States. From the Pacific to the Atlantic, we suddenly had a medium of fast transportation. People were able to move out west, and the land was cheap. There wasn't a lot of consideration of the indigenous peoples who inhabited these areas, and very quickly lands were seized up. Now, interestingly enough, on the Colorado Plateau, the environment is so arid and so hostile. The Colorado Plateau is actually the last area in the lower 48 states to be mapped. And it was really a remote wilderness. And it wasn't until the late 1860s, 1870s, when the Civil War veteran known as John Wesley Powell, a one-armed Civil War veteran who later helped found the National Geographic Society, he and his fellow explorers decided to travel down the Colorado River. They started up on the Green River, which is a tributary into the Colorado River, and they were the first to go all the way down through the Grand Canyon, and they did it twice. And in doing so, they mapped out what was left of the wilderness in the West. They mapped out the Henry Mountains, which is an area just outside of Capitol Reef where I was this morning. Really remote area, really fantastic, beautiful location. But as peoples continued to move out west, there was a lot of utilitarian motive to grab land, to grab resources, and to abuse those resources, because without fully understanding ecological impacts of land fragmentation or of over harvesting wildlife for a food resource or for an economic resource, we were quickly losing what made the American West so unique and so fantastic. Fortunately, we had a man who became president who was concerned about the environment and the wilderness, or what remained of the wilderness. And this, of course, was Theodore Roosevelt, who was the vice president to the 25th president of the United States. President McKinley was assassinated, and Vice President Roosevelt became the 26th president of the United States. I was very concerned in preserving and conserving lands all across the American landscape, particularly in the West. This is a fantastic speech that he gave here at the edge of the Grand Canyon, talking to the peoples in the territory of Arizona to try and convince them to not dam the Colorado River, to not exploit the resources in the Grand Canyon. Trying to convince the people to protect this natural wonder rather than exploit it for economic gain. And this is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt that I think is relevant to this topic and this presentation, and so I want to read it to you here. I want to ask you to keep this great wonder of nature as it is now. I hope you will not have a building of any kind, not a summer cottage, a hotel, or anything else, to mar the wonderful grandeur, the sublimity, the great loneliness and beauty of the canyon. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. This was a cry of immense, I guess, immense responsibility that Theodore Roosevelt was asking his fellow Americans to please recognize the beauty and the precious value of these natural wonders, of these landscapes, well before anyone else was really considering that they might have value other than immediate economic gain. Theodore Roosevelt's begging his fellow citizens to please protect these areas, not just for the current generation, but for many generations to come. He met with a lot of opposition, but also because he was a very prolific advocate of protecting wilderness. Thankfully, through the help of the organic, or my mind just drew a blank, the Organic Act of 1906, he ended up protecting a lot of resources by creating national monuments, including Mesa Verde, as well as many others. And in doing so, we began the process of protecting these national treasures. We created forest reserves, wildlife reserves. We created national parks, national wildlife refuges. And in doing so, we preserved many species that would otherwise have gone extinct. And today's presentation is really about some of the biodiversity in these incredible areas. And I'd like to talk to you today just briefly about some of the unique species that inhabit these areas. If you're ever going to come out to the Southwest, these are some of the creatures that you'll have the opportunity to see and to learn about. Again, I was just talking to Kendall right before this presentation. It was 1 degree this morning. We are at a high elevation here. I'm at 7,000 feet currently above sea level. And people often think that the Southwest, the Grand Canyon, Zion National Park, Bryce, they think that they're very hot places, and they are in the summertime. But like all deserts, there's a huge, dramatic, volatile change in temperature throughout the year, and even throughout the 24-hour day. That's what makes this area such an incredible place. Here we receive on average about 7 inches of rain annually. So it's a dry, very arid location. Not a lot of trees other than pinyon pines and junipers, sometimes locally known as cedars, but they're not true cedars. We also have a lot of sagebrush. We have yucca. We have lots of varieties of cactus. And we also have a lot of biodiversity, but the animals that are living here have adapted to live in extreme environments where in the summer we can be 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or in the winter we can be -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, very, very extreme variations of temperature, which make the biodiversity so unique and so special for being adapted here on this landscape. We on the Colorado Plateau have everything from elk to black bears to, of course, lizards, rattlesnakes, condors, turkey vultures. Historically, we actually even had grizzly bears. We had wolves. We do have the reintroduced population subspecies, the Mexican gray wolf down in Arizona and New Mexico. But some of those large predators were able to, perhaps not in as great of densities as we have in the Northern Rockies, those populations of grizzlies and wolves were able to subsist here in the Colorado Plateau, which is an example of just how prolific life can be here in this desert. Rattlesnakes, the Great Basin rattlesnake is one of the more charismatic species that we have out here. One of my friends who works with me, he's a rattlesnake biologist, and he's fascinated with these creatures. Very interesting mammals as well. The ring-tailed cat, which is pretty rare to see, but they actually inhabit in a decent population, Zion National Park, where it's very possible that you can see one. And of course, we have ravens, or the common raven. Ravens are a unique species that have adapted to live not only in the Arctic north, but also, again, across the Southwest. What's unique about this species, one of many things, is its dark coloration. You would think that a species living in a really hot climate would not have such a dark color about it, but obviously dark is not an unfamiliar fur or feather color here in the Southwest. We have California condors, which, as most of us know, were a species that are on the rise. They're successfully coming back from the very brink of extinction. In the early 1980s, we had fewer than 24 left in the wild. And as a drastic measure to try and save this species from complete extinction, biologists went out and captured this largest of the North American birds and brought them into captive facilities where we raised them and protected them and helped eventually reintroduce populations. You have a population throughout California, throughout Arizona, and actually a pair in Zion National Park, and we hope over the years to see this population continue to expand. Lead poisoning was the original weak link, I guess, for the condor. Lead poisoning, as animals were shot and harvested by hunting, the gut piles of the harvested animals were left out for vultures to eat, and they were typically riddled with lead shot, and The lead poisoning ultimately was one of the greatest undoings of the California condor, but since then we're seeing a dramatic increase in this species population, which is fantastic. We have what is perhaps my favorite megafaunal species out here, which is the pronghorn antelope, or the antelope goat. This very unique species is one of a kind. It doesn't have any immediate cousins, anything that is really at all closely related to it. It's not a goat, it's not necessarily a bovid, and it's not an antelope. Its closest relatives have all gone extinct back in the Pleistocene, but this is the second fastest land animal on Earth after the cheetah, accelerating at speeds over 60 miles per hour. Very unique animal, very charismatic, with incredible eyesight, and moving that fast across the landscape, there's really nothing that can eat it or catch it and kill it when it reaches adulthood. I forgot to mention too that this species was probably the most numerous of all North American ungulates or hoofed animals up until the great slaughter of the 19th century. In the 19th century, most of us are familiar with westward expansion and the commercialization of wildlife. Bison populations, which were 30 million strong across North America, dwindled to just a few thousand. Pronghorn were probably the second most numerous ungulate species after bison, but their population crashed due to market hunting as well. But fortunately, their population is on the rise. You see a lot of these out in the Southwest, and as I said, being the second fastest animal in the world, and the fastest animal on the continent, there's not a lot that can prey upon them once they reach adulthood, once they mature. One exception is, of course, this wily animal, the coyote, or the coyote, as some of us call them. Coyotes are very wonderful, mystic, kind of an occult species with a lot of superstition behind them and a lot of reverence behind them. Also a lot of irreverence behind them. A lot of people are irritated by coyotes, just as they are with a lot of predators, unfortunately. But coyotes are one of the biggest predators impacting pronghorn populations, because coyotes have the ability to sniff out fawns of pronghorn, and when the pronghorn are just a week or 2 weeks old, before they can reach those insanely fast speeds, these coyotes will go out and they'll prey upon the fawns of the pronghorn. Coyotes are a very dynamic species, and if you're listening in from North America, whether it's Canada, whether it's New York, whether it's Florida, whether it's California, you should all be familiar with the coyote. Coyote, or Canis latrans, is a cousin of the gray wolf. They actually share similar DNA, about 94%. That's about the same percentage as you and an orangutan. So you and an orangutan are just as closely related as a gray wolf is to a coyote, which makes you wonder when people see coyotes and they see gray wolves and they get them mixed up. It makes you wonder if coyotes and wolves look at us and orangutans and get us mixed up. Coyotes are much smaller than the gray wolf or Canis lupus, and coyotes have their origin here in North America. Their closest relative is the jackal, but a million years ago, as these populations diverged, evolutionarily speaking, the ancestor of the wolf and the jackal migrated across the Bering Land Bridge, actually into the Old World from the New World, and then reversed as time went on, and gray wolves came back into North America in 3 successive waves. The coyote never left, more or less. It is unique to North America, and it evolved here on the continent. The gray wolf's average weight is about 100 pounds. The coyote is about 30 pounds, so significantly smaller. Oftentimes they look a lot bigger because of their fur. I go before dawn every morning. I go on about a 4 or 5 mile hike with my dog, which is a big German Shepherd, and it's pretty common for us to run into coyotes on the trail. And it's funny because she sees jackrabbits or cottontails and she takes off after them. But when she sees coyotes, she won't run. She doesn't bark either. And she's a barker. She likes to bark at just about everything, but when she sees coyotes, she freezes and stays by me, which is probably a good thing. Like wolves, coyotes are they're cooperative breeders, which means that you typically have a dominant breeding pair, a male and a female, a heterosexual pair that mate, and then they have several generations of offspring that live together in a pack. Not quite as dramatically as a wolf. One of the reasons why we don't see such dramatic pack populations or cohesion is because these animals frequently are disrupted either by human hunters or by other predators moving into the area and shaking apart these family systems or these family units that coyotes have. Here in the Southwest, the most common predator, aside from humans, of the coyote is the cougar. If you go further north, where we have wolves up in the northern Rockies, the wolf is the #1 enemy of the coyote, and it's pretty incredible to see just how territorial wolves can be of coyotes. Coyotes are a mesopredator or a mesocarnivore. They fit that medium scale, and so with the absence of wolves on the landscape, their population has been able to thrive and to grow exponentially. Historically, they were a Western species. If you read the journals of Lewis and Clark, they documented what species were novel or new to them, and they didn't actually encounter any coyotes until they reached the Missouri River. And there they started to see these fox-like animals that they weren't sure if it was a fox. They knew it was too small to be a wolf, but it looked like a wolf. Eventually, they settled on calling it the prairie wolf, a much smaller species they recognized. But again, as I pointed out, wolves and coyotes are pretty different. Coyote is actually coyote has a word in Aztec roots, which again just goes to show how tied this species is to North America. It's a very unique and charismatic animal. As time has moved on and as we eradicated our larger predators, specifically wolves, coyotes have spread across North America. We've had a population that has grown from being here in the west to now out in the southeast and to the northeast, and actually further up into the north as well. So coyotes are very dynamic, highly adaptable, and as a mesopredator, they're able to subsist in our backyards without much detection. These animals are also so fecund that regardless of very draconian methods that we as humans have tried to eliminate them or to annihilate them, regardless of our draconian efforts, this species has been able to increase in number and continues to grow. I'm pretty critical of coyote regulatory methods or draconian methods to decrease the population. I understand that predators are difficult to live with, but that being said, I do acknowledge that the coyote is doing pretty well overall. It's remarkable how it's responded to our efforts to suppress it as a predator. Of course, we have other very unique and endemic species. The Utah prairie dog is one of the favorite sources of food for coyotes, among other things. The Utah prairie dog is an endangered species found just outside of Bryce. We also have desert bighorn sheep, another very charismatic species of megafauna that we have here in the Southwest. Now, desert bighorn sheep are the same species as regular bighorn sheep or Rocky Mountain sheep, Ovis canadensis. They are a subspecies, however, here in the Southwest, and really they have this niche on the Colorado Plateau that you wouldn't be able to see hardly anywhere else. But this photo, which was taken just outside of Zion National Park, shows them in their dynamic landscape. These animals, the subspecies, desert bighorn sheep, are slightly smaller than the Rocky Mountain version, but again, ultimately, it is the same species. And we do a lot of research, actually, trying to help bighorn sheep populations all across North America. This species inhabits the American West. They're closely related to the Dall sheep, or these almost like a white version of this species. It's the same genus, but Dall sheep are found up in Alaska, and bighorn sheep are found again through the northern Rockies and the central Rockies, and this subspecies is found here on the Colorado Plateau. Doing research on these animals, as you can imagine, can be very challenging. You can see where they live in these very rocky Navajo sandstone cliff alcoves. And to get to them, it's very challenging. We have to utilize helicopters where we go in and we capture these animals with nets, and then we sling them back to a staging area. And here we test them, number one, for a disease, a pneumonia, a strain of pneumonia that affects all bighorn sheep and is ultimately fatal to this incredible animal. Bighorn sheep are closely enough related to domestic sheep that they can actually interbreed with them, but domestic sheep have immunity to this very common strain of pneumonia. And unfortunately, they transmit the disease to wild sheep. And so oftentimes when you have wild sheep overlapping in habitat with domestic sheep, this disease spreads very quickly. It's highly contagious. It develops as a cough in the lungs, and the populations can completely crash. This is not just with desert bighorn sheep, it's with bighorn sheep, again, all across North America. And so we as scientists were trying very hard to monitor populations to make sure that these animals are healthy, to test to see if they have this mycoplasma, this pneumonia. We take swabs, basically like long Q-tips, and we swab their nose. I guess in this age of COVID-19, we're all pretty familiar with similar procedures. But basically we swab the nose and we check the tonsils, and we swab the tonsils as well, and we take blood samples from these animals. It's incredible that an animal like this can live in an area with what we would perceive as very inhospitable. There's not a lot of vegetation. There's almost no water, and they're living on these high red rock cliffs. And yet, if they don't happen to get any disease, if they don't get any sickness, and they can do pretty darn well, and it's very remarkable. This is an area outside of San Rafael Swell where not too long ago, just a couple months ago, we had a mortality signal from one of our radio collars go off, and we had to go and collect the collar. So if the animal doesn't move for 4 hours or more, then the radio collar that we have on the animal goes into a mortality mode, which indicates that the collar either fell off or the animal died. And as you can imagine, if an animal dies and you need to go get the radio collar to collect the data that's been put on the radio collar, it could be really challenging to get to where these sheep decide to die. So fortunately, we are trained in rock climbing and rappelling, and eventually we can get to where the animal died, and we can collect the radio collar for future analyzation and learning about the population movements of the species. Now in this case, when we got to the collar, we found that the body had been stashed. It had been killed and then buried. And that brings us to the apex predator of this ecosystem. Here in the Southwest, where we have an absence of wolves, the apex predator of fearsome reputation is, of course, the cougar, or puma concolor. The cougar, also known as the mountain lion, or the puma, or the panther, or the painter, or the catamount, is all the same species. The cougar is the second largest felid in North America. After the jaguar actually does come up into parts of Mexico and even Arizona. But these large, powerful animals can get pretty prevalent, and their population can grow exponentially in some areas as long as they have a dynamic and healthy food resource. And bighorn sheep make excellent meals for this animal that is just as capable in many ways of getting up onto high cliffs and rocky alcoves as the bighorn sheep are. The average weight for a male is generally between 120 and 170 pounds. For females, it's 80 to 120 pounds. In different areas of the continent, or even South America, so the two continents where we compare weight of this animal, the weight really varies depending on where this animal's at. But around here in the desert environment, they generally are in the 150 pound range if they're males. Cougars, unlike wolves and grizzly bears that have what's known as a seasonal breeding period or a seasonal gestation or seasonal whelping period. Cougars can breed at any time of the year. So wolves, for example, and bears, they breed at one time of the year and then they give birth at another time of the year. Same thing goes with deer, with elk, etc. But there's a polyestrous cycle among cougars. So as long as resources are good, the cougar can actually reproduce at any time of year. It's common for them in this environment, though, to actually breed generally in the summer and give birth 90 days later. Kittens that are typically born are usually 2 per female. Sometimes it's more. And eventually the mom will kick these young kittens off to go find territories of their own after the kittens are a year to a year and a half old. So this is pretty interesting because unlike, again, other species that have one reproductive cycle per annum, these animals are capable of reproducing at any time of year. Males are very territorial, and so in a large area, you typically have one male that patrols his territory, and within his territory you have several overlapping home ranges of females. So 3 or 4 females to every one male. The males are very, again, territorial. They defend their territory, they defend their mates. They'll practice infanticide pretty regularly if they feel threatened by someone else's kittens coming into the area. They'll fight other dispersing or transient juveniles that are trying to make their own living. And of course, these animals are carnivores, and carnivores are very interesting, and they can cause a lot of problems. But as we all know and should be aware, to be a carnivore means that the animal must feed on flesh. In order to survive, it needs to kill and eat other animals. Out here where we have ranching with sheep and with other forms of livestock like cattle, lions, dispersing lions, can turn to preying on livestock, which again can become contentious. But this species is really interesting because they were pushed almost to the very brink of extinction back in the early 1900s, but the populations have since been recovering. And actually today in the American West, we have as many cougars now, we estimate, as were here when Lewis and Clark came west. This species actually went from the Pacific to the Atlantic historically. There are still an absence of cougars in many states to the east, but as the population has continued to grow in the west, we're seeing a lot of immigration where these animals are moving further and further east. And it's not surprising for us to hear about cougars being sighted in places like Missouri or Oklahoma or Nebraska. Cougars actually also have the largest distribution of any species in the Western Hemisphere to date too. They not only live in North America, but they run through Central America as well as South America. So a really cool and dynamic species. Today, an estimated 30,000 cougars live in the American West. And interestingly enough, they are the only large cat species in the world with an expanding population and range. So in a time when we're alarmed by the decreasing amount of lions and tigers and leopards and jaguars, take heart and know that cougars are doing well. As I already mentioned, cougars are very dynamic and healthy predators, and because they're so good at what they do, they can impact their prey populations for good and sometimes for ill. A lot of people don't recognize this. They think that there's a balance in nature. That balance is looking at things on a pretty broad scope. There are certain climactic events where you can have subsidized predation, where cougars can do really well by eating bighorn sheep and, for example, mule deer. And then if bighorn sheep are getting sick and they're dying out from other factors, or their populations are decreasing from other regulatory factors, and cougar populations are remaining abundant, then in some cases the bighorn sheep populations can suffer from what's known as additive predation, where mountain lions are consuming more bighorn sheep than is sustainable for the bighorn sheep population. And sometimes we hear about this in Nevada and in parts of Utah and Arizona and California, there's an alarm where you have so many predators on the landscape, but the prey populations are struggling. They have different factors that are limiting their population density. Of course, we also have our raptors. The Southwest is known for its raptor population, and we go out and we study and color and band golden eagles as well as other forms of raptors. And people often forget, they're kind of blown away that we do have bears out here. I mentioned that historically we had grizzly bears. Utah lost its last grizzly bear in 1923 when it was shot, just like most other states that destroyed their large carnivore populations. But we still do have actually a very robust population of black bears that is growing throughout the state. And we have mule deer. This area of the world is pretty unique to North America because we only have mule deer. We don't have white-tailed deer. Mule deer are an endemic western species in North America. They're large. They're sometimes known as black-tailed deer. Odocoileus hemionus is the name in Latin for this very incredible species. I mentioned today that I was out and about collaring these animals and studying them. These deer are very robust in how they can live and maneuver on this landscape. But as I've mentioned in earlier presentations that I've given for NatHab, we are concerned about mule deer populations because they are on a decline in many different regions. People in most places, especially if you're out east, you complain about how there are too many deer. You had a very low population of white-tailed deer, and thanks to conservation efforts, now you have way too many white-tailed deer. Here in this region, we actually have mule deer populations that are struggling, and they're decreasing, and we don't have white-tailed deer out here. Some of the reasons why the mule deer populations are struggling is, number one, climatic events. Drought is impacting these species. You have a low recruitment or survivability of fawns due to harsh winters, dry summers. You also have a lot of habitat fragmentation. So as more people move into the Intermountain West, of course they buy up the lands that look prettiest for their house to sit on, and it's fragmenting wildlife population habitat. And so mule deer populations are really struggling. And we're also concerned of other diseases such as chronic wasting disease, which is an aberrant protein in the central nervous system that eventually leads to death. I gave a presentation recently on chronic wasting disease. Mule deer populations, though, they are perhaps the most well-known megafauna species here in the American Southwest. You can see them in Arizona, in New Mexico, in Colorado, in Utah, and Nevada. They have this really unique pattern or growth pattern in their antlers, which is indicative of the mule deer and lets you know that it's not a white-tailed deer that you're looking at. If you check out their antlers, they're bifurcated rather than having a central beam and several tines coming up off of it. They also have those very large ears, which is why they have the appellation mule deer. And of course, rather than having a white tail, they have a tip of black on their tails, which is why they have the name black-tailed deer in some areas. We also have bison out here, which often get overlooked, but bison are here in the American Southwest, and actually we have one of the only genetically pure free-ranging bison herds left in the world. The bison that we have just outside of Capitol Reef National Park were brought down from Yellowstone National Park in the 1940s, and we also have since transplanted them into other areas of the Southwest. Up on the Book Cliffs, we have several indigenous groups with the Ute tribe specifically working to help repopulate areas with bison. Bison are the largest megafaunal species in North America. The males can reach over 2,000 pounds. This is from 2 months ago. This is actually just a yearling cow. She was probably a dainty 600 pounds, but she'll get up to about 1,000 pounds. And we also actually have elk in a lot of areas. Now, unlike mule deer, elk are doing well just about everywhere in North America, especially in the West. This is the time of the elk. We're seeing very robust elk populations all across North America, continuing to grow and to thrive. I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I was hoping I could talk more about some of those other species, but I noticed that I was getting carried away, and I'd like to thank you all again for participating in this topic today. The American Southwest is a very unique, incredibly diverse landscape. There's a lot of biodiversity. There's a lot of incredible geology, natural history, human history that you can all explore here. I hope you have the opportunity to someday come out and visit. If you haven't been, if you've already been, come back. This is, again, a really incredible place that we have here on this planet.
Thank you, Aaron. That was wonderful. We've got some good questions for you. So, but before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to remind folks watching, if you have a question for Aaron, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. All right, first question. A couple people were curious if pronghorns are susceptible to chronic wasting disease.
They aren't. They are not. There's not been a documented transmission from chronic wasting disease leaving the cervidae or the deer family. So that isn't to say that it could never happen. There's always, in science, you always have to be careful, and there's always a small chance that it could cross over or spill over from one genus or family group to another. But as of right now, they are not at all susceptible to it.
Okay. And there were a few people who were curious about when you mentioned bighorn sheep and getting pneumonia, is there any sort of vaccination or treatment for this if it's found in an individual? And also, if a predator would eat a bighorn sheep that is sick, could it get sick as well?
Good question. So I'll start with that question in reverse. The transmission of this pneumonia, or this strain of pneumonia, this mycoplasma, does not extend beyond that genus. So it's really hard and fortunately very difficult for any species to contract an illness if they are not related to the infected species. So that's fortunate for us. For example, with chronic wasting disease, which affects members of the deer family, humans have been known frequently to eat deer with chronic wasting disease. Wolves eat deer with chronic wasting disease. Cougars eat deer with chronic wasting disease. Fortunately, there's a lot of molecular challenges for the disease or the illness to spill over from one infected species to a non-related species. Occasionally that happens. We're all familiar with coronavirus, right? So that was a spillover case where we had one infected species not related directly to humans, and it did spill over into humans. And now it's also been documented in dogs and mink, and I think some zoo lions or tigers and stuff like that. So no, if a cougar does consume sheep with pneumonia, it will not get sick, fortunately. And if I am handling that sheep, I'm not going to get sick. The strain is different enough that it's not going to infect my body. There isn't a vaccination, unfortunately, and it is 100% mortality. So it's pretty alarming. It's just like our type of pneumonia. They start to cough, they get sick, it spreads to the lungs, the lungs fill up with fluid, and the animal does die. And it's pretty darn devastating, especially since these are herd animals. So if one animal in the herd gets sick, it's very quick for it to spread to the other animals in the herd. Another disease that affects bighorn sheep that I didn't mention is pink eye. Now, pink eye is just like our kind of pink eye, but it does not kill the animal, but it does cause temporary blindness. And as you can imagine, if you're living on a cliff, being temporary blind is not a good thing, and so it can cause population limitations.
All right. So there's a couple people who live in more urban areas who noticed whenever they've seen coyotes in their neck of the woods, they don't ever see them in pairs or packs. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so coyotes have the opportunity biologically of participating in what's known as cooperative breeding. So you have two heterosexual pairs and several generations of offspring. As the offspring mature, they eventually disperse. It's very similar to what we as humans do, right? That's kind of an oversimplification of of the family unit, but again, 2 parents, several generations of children. As the children grow up, they want to disperse. Coyotes are monogamous and they do mate for life. And so if they do not have enough resources to support a large pack, which is most typical among coyotes, compared to wolves, where wolves generally remain together in a large family unit, then the 2 breeding coyotes will rear their young until they are independent. So within the first year, those pups or those juveniles will leave and they'll disperse. In urban areas, it's very common for us to see single dispersing coyotes. So we don't see pairs very often, typically because in urban areas, they're being hit by cars, they're living independently, they're looking for mates. They might have a mate and you might not see it, but yeah, generally we don't see coyotes in packs, although they are cooperative breeders. And so really quick, just to add some more dimension to that answer, in Yellowstone National Park, we eliminated all of the wolves in 1926, and it was 70 years before we reintroduced wolves. In that 70-year period, we saw coyotes reach basically density dependence. We had a lot of coyotes on the landscape, and they formed large packs of 6 to 10 individuals, and they lived and behaved very, very much like wolves. As soon as we reintroduced the wolves became a disruption to that family unit kind of lifestyle, and wolves began to kill coyotes. And now it's again less frequent and less common for you to go to Yellowstone National Park and see a pack of coyotes.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to call it there with questions. It's getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to leave time for closing comments. So I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Again, this was kind of a hodgepodge travelogue. I'm glad that you were able to tune in. This is a part of the world, again, that is very unique, very colorful, very rich in biodiversity, as well as history and culture and geology. I hope you all have the opportunity to come out here. If you're going to come out anytime in the next few months, bundle up because it's cold. But again, welcome everyone to the Southwest, and I hope you have an opportunity to travel with Natural Habitat sometime in the future.
Thank you, Aaron. Another wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time today, especially I know you're so busy in your day-to-day work. So thank you again. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.